Good afternoon and welcome to the SASFIN Immigration webinar. My name is Johan Gous and I'm the Head of Advice at SASFIN Wealth. We are glad you could join us for today's discussion around a topic that continues to grow in relevance as the world has become a much smaller place and as individuals and households consider alternative destinations to live in, to work in, invest in, and also to retire. Now, moving your belongings, and rearranging your family life is already a great challenge when you're considering moving abroad. And then one still has to deal with the very important element of your financial affairs. And it is for this reason that we thought it would be a good idea to assist our clients and potential clients and help them navigate their way when it comes to what we call financial immigration. We'll be covering aspects such as the meaning of the term financial immigration, the implications of ceasing to be a tax resident, tax implications for expatriates, estate planning, and then also investment and retirement planning. Now, joining us today to help us unpack this very broad, complex, and sometimes intimidating topic is a highly experienced team of financial specialists. Now, first of all, we have Sarah Simpson, who is our Head of Fiduciary Services at SASFIN Wealth, and who specialises in assisting individuals and families in structuring their estates in the most effective way possible when it comes to the intergenerational wealth transfer. And welcome to you today, Sarah.
Thank you, Johan.
And then we have Andrew Wellstead, who is an international tax specialist and a director of RM Partners. Now, Andrew is a highly regarded tax practitioner and is a lawyer by training. He specializes in tax and transactional structuring solutions and has significant tax litigation experience, and he has excellent relationships with numerous South African regulators. He also has written numerous articles and that has been included in several international lawyers' publications. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, Johan. Thank you.
And last but not least, from the beautiful Eastern Cape, we've got Gavin Kane, who is a senior wealth advisor at SASFIN Wealth with many years of financial advisory experience. We're going to see how Gavin's line is there from the Eastern Cape, because I know that the Eastern Cape has been struggling with the telecoms a bit in recent weeks. But welcome to you, Gavin.
Good afternoon, everybody. I trust that you can hear me and see me. Obviously,
great.
Don't have the same credentials as Sarah when it comes to being seen, but it's lovely to talk to all of you.
Great. Welcome, Gavin. Thank you. But Sarah, we're going to start with you and with some of the basic elements that we need to consider when looking to immigrate, and starting specifically with one's tax status. Now, Sarah, how would you determine if someone is a tax resident in South Africa, and what are the implications of being found to be a tax resident?
Okay, so before I start, I just want to set some basic ground rules. There seems to be such confusion between different concepts. So for instance, people seem to confuse tax residency with exchange control and immigration requirements. So first of all, we need to make sure that those two concepts are completely distinguished. Being a tax resident or a non-tax resident is one issue, and being subject to exchange control and exchange control resident is another issue. The process to change either one of those things is completely different. So we're going to talk a little bit about tax residency being the most important thing, and then I think Andrew will delve a little bit more into exchange control a little bit later. But to focus on tax residency is the starting point. So before you look at exchange control, you would want to consider whether you even are a tax resident. And the three ways to determine whether you are a tax resident would be as follows. Number one, I am ordinarily resident. So I believe that South Africa is my home. This is very difficult because it's a relatively subjective test. So you may be sitting in the kitchen one night drinking a glass of wine and decide that's it, your days are over, you're moving overseas, and that emotional determination sets whether you're ordinarily resident or not. The difficulty with this concept is that we also require certain facts to be fulfilled to show or to depict that you have had this change in mindset. So a typical example of this would be you're looking at some clients who decided they were very clever and they climbed on a yacht. It's called the World and it goes round and round and round the world. And they decided that they're not going to be a South African tax resident because they don't stop in South Africa for longer than a certain amount of days. And they won't be tax resident anyway because this boat is moving around. So typically, if you had your wife and your kids remaining in South Africa, your slippers under the bed, your dogs needing to be fed, all your clubs, your memberships, the house in Bantry Bay, you're still ordinarily resident. And not only that, you're also showing by those facts, you're depicting that your mental subjective state of mind is actually to return to South Africa. So that's the complexity with being ordinarily resident. Then to try and break ordinarily residency, basically you're looking at certain factors of which exchange control residency would be one factor to show that you are wanting to break that. Now, that's not the only way to be a tax resident. So if you're in South Africa for more than a certain amount of days, and this is a completely factual test, it's a calculation, it's pure raw data to calculate whether you're a physical tax resident. So if you're in South Africa for 91 days in the previous year of assessment, and 91 days in the 5 preceding years of assessment before then, and 915 days in aggregate for the 5 preceding years before then, you become a physical tax resident. So the difficulty with that is that you need to make sure if you have your state of mind to be in South Africa, calculating days doesn't help you. Days in, days out, it makes no difference. So if you're showing that you are intending to return to South Africa from your wanderings, or that South Africa is the place of your habitual abode, don't go and count days because that's not going to assist. Another manner to determine whether you're going to be tax resident is in terms of any double tax agreement, if you're deemed to be solely tax resident in a country, that can create a tax residency. So there really are 3 ways in which tax residency can be determined. And conversely, if you cease tax residency, you can break your ordinary tax residence, but you also need to show factors that back up this to say, I have had a change of mind, but there's certain factors that support this change in my state of mind.
Okay, Sarah, so how do you then actually cease tax residency, and how would your non-tax residency status really affect your taxation status?
So we get this question from a lot of clients, and a lot of clients tend to go to start counting days. So please, whatever you do, don't be one of those people who says, oh, I'm out of South Africa for 183 days and therefore I'm not on the tax base. So we're going to get to a couple of do's and don'ts, but don't calculate 183 days as making you exempt. In order to become a non-tax resident or to cease tax residency, you really have 3 options available to you. You have to demonstrate that you are no longer ordinarily resident in South Africa. The demonstration might be selling your house, giving up all your club memberships, taking the kids out of school, financially immigrating. So that could potentially be evidence to show that you are no longer ordinarily resident. The second thing is that you may want to break a physical presence test. Don't work on 183 days, and if I say to you, you may even need 330 days to break a physical presence test, please don't go and count those days. This is a very technical calculation to be left to a very experienced attorney only. And thirdly, if you are considered to be solely tax resident in another country, according to a double tax agreement, that means that you will no longer be a South African resident. Only with those 3 ways can you actually cease South African tax residency. Now, it's very important to make sure that you understand which one would be applicable to you. Now, if you were to cease South African tax residency, what does it mean to you? What are the effects? The effects would basically be that you would have a CGT payable. That would be your exit tax. So we have a lot of people that say, well, I never ceased tax residency because I left and I went to Bali on holiday and I was supposed to stay there on holiday and I decided life there was so much better. I decided to build myself a shack on the beach and stay in Bali forever. At some point, you changed your subjective state of mind, then you have ceased tax residency. So there's no point saying, well, exit tax isn't applicable to me because I changed my mind while I was in Bali. So the moment you cease tax residency, you will have exit tax payable on your deemed wide disposal of your worldwide assets. Now, this is very scary because I have a lot of people that say, well, hang on a second, I've spent all my life expatriating money. I've got money in Switzerland, I've got money in Germany. And they feel that because they've gone through an exchange control process to expatriate money, that these assets should not be subject to exit tax. But remember, you pay exit tax on your worldwide assets. So don't try to limit yourself to calculating your South African assets. Another example, Johan, just to delve into typical assets that people may ask about is they want to know, well, I want to immigrate, but I've left my house in Bantry Bay because I can't get the price that I paid for it. And does this mean that I have a connection or a tie to South Africa? Does this mean that I can't immigrate? So leaving a property in South Africa doesn't prevent you from immigrating. It may be a factor to show that you have a tie to South Africa, but you can happily immigrate. And it's good to know that there is no exit tax on immovable property. But don't get too excited about this. Whilst that sounds absolutely wonderful, you actually leave your property within the South African tax net anyway. So don't get too excited that there's some type of amazing exemption here. It will still be subject to tax in South Africa. Another question that we get a lot is people who leave businesses. They decide to immigrate and they leave a running business entity in South Africa. It's important to note that you do pay CGT or your exit tax on a business. And the difficulty is if you're not selling those shares, you may not have money in your hands and you may not have the liquidity to pay that exit tax. So it's very important to plan in advance and understand what type of exit tax you will pay on that remaining business. Now, funnily enough, it's interesting to note that companies that hold shares in immovable property are also subject to exit tax. There's been a little bit of a change there. So if you hold your immovable property directly, you won't pay exit tax. But if you hold shares that holds immovable property, you will have exit tax. So the quick answer to that is, as a South African tax resident, you're taxable on your worldwide income. But the moment you cease tax residency, you're only taxed on South African sourced income. Just a couple of do's and don'ts, as I said. Please don't ever assume that there's a 183-day rule that's applicable. There seems to be something going around that was connected to a very small part of legislation that's not applicable across the board. And another thing is, please don't try and calculate your year of assessment and the amount of days that you've been in South Africa to break your physical presence test. Do go see an international tax attorney to calculate those days for you, because a very small day difference, being sick, being in transit, all of that can break a day's test. So go to an expert.
Great. So yeah, I suppose, this is a very tricky field and one have to make sure you speak to the right people. But you've mentioned, the double tax agreements. Can you maybe just explain to us exactly what does it mean, the double tax agreement, and in which circumstances would double tax agreements provide you with some reprieve from a taxation perspective?
So I'm going to give a typical example. A double tax agreement is, in simplistic terms, when you have a foot in each country and it is not clear in which country you are taxable. Well, it may be clear, or both countries may have a claim to tax you. So a typical example of this is someone who perhaps has left to go live in Mauritius and they come back and they spend 5 months of a year in South Africa for business reasons. If you're looking at an instance where South Africa and Mauritius can each one of those determine that you are one of their tax residents. So in this example, let's say, for instance, you have your home or your house in Mauritius. Mauritius may be claiming that it's taxing you as being ordinarily resident in Mauritius. And South Africa might say, well, you fulfill the physical tax test, physical presence tax test. So therefore, you are our tax resident, in which case you're sitting with both countries claiming that they can tax you. So typically with a double tax agreement, you may have something such as a tiebreaker test, which means that each country will see which country has the most ties to you. So they will start to look at, do you have a home? If you have a home in one country, it's more likely that you have ties to the country in which you have a home. And you will work your way through those tests to determine which country is allowed to tax you. But double tax agreements are an exceptionally complex area. Don't ever assume that double tax agreements are similar. Don't even assume that there's one in place. And all of these can be thrown out by different jurisdiction that may not have the same double tax agreement. So just make sure that you consult a proper attorney when you're looking at double tax agreements, and whether they can actually offer you some reprieve from both countries wanting to tax you on different bases, one as ordinarily resident and one as physically present.
Sarah, so then on to your field of expertise here as well, when we look at wealth preservation as one of the key elements of holistic financial planning. So if you decide to immigrate, how would your relocation really affect the way you should look at your estate planning strategy?
So, Johan, if you're looking to relocate abroad and you are going to have multiple assets in multiple jurisdictions, it's very important to understand that different jurisdictions have different legislation on inheritance law. So you would want to make sure that you consult an expert in each jurisdiction on what the inheritance law is in each country. Some of those laws are just applicable if you become domiciled or you become a resident, and they have a different basis for applying those laws to you. So very important to understand it's not a cut and paste for all inheritance laws. Another thing is, you may assume your marital regime falls under a certain marital regime, like you're looking in community of property, out of community of property. When you move to another country, there may be a different assumption of your marital regime, and it's very important to speak to a local expert there to understand what the permutations would be on your marital regime. Another thing is, if you have assets in different jurisdictions, you need to understand that there's a different estate administration process for each jurisdiction. So you would need to consult an expert in every different jurisdiction to understand what the administration process is. Another thing is, you're looking at different tax laws for each jurisdiction. You may have a capital asset in a jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction is going to tax you capital gains tax, and the jurisdiction that you live in may be taxing you on your worldwide assets, excluding that capital asset. And you would want to make sure that you understand the taxability of each asset. Another difficult thing is, a lot of clients leave South Africa and they leave family trusts in South Africa, which creates some exchange control technical difficulties and some tax challenges. Once again, you need to consult on this. Don't assume that you'll remain unaffected by leaving assets in a trust. And then last but not least, having a look at having multiple wills in multiple jurisdictions is also important. The moment you start scattering your assets around the world, you want to make sure that you have an applicable will for that jurisdiction. And that would pretty much give you an idea of what you would need to look at should you want to have an estate planning strategy that's relevant to your worldwide estate.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to let you go for now. Andrew, I'd like to now move across to you and explore the issues around what SA residents are allowed to do and not to do given the current exchange control regime in South Africa. So first of all, what is happening around exchange control? We're hearing so many conflicting reports about whether or not it will be repealed. What's your view on this?
The stated policy of the government, and this was stated in the budget, is that it will be repealed. And I'll actually just read to you quickly from Annex E, which was part of the budget pack. Some of the things they said: over the next 12 months, the new capital flow management system will be put in place. Will be. All foreign currency transactions will be allowed, except for a risk-based list. There's a small list. Okay. Example on treatment of individuals. They say immigrants and natural person residents will be treated identically. Okay. So to me, the budget statement made it absolutely clear that exchange controls are going to be removed almost in total. Okay. There's a short list of transactions that are going to require approval, but many of those are short-lived. The idea is for most of them to be replaced by tax rules. So exchange control is officially going. What has cast a little bit of doubt on it is obviously coronavirus people believe it could change anything. So perhaps coronavirus will force a rethink. Nothing that has been stated that suggests that it's forced a rethink. And we've lived with exchange controls for so long. It's quite difficult to imagine suddenly, they're going to be repealed. Why would they do it now, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's very good reasons for for repealing exchange controls, dealing with international transactions all the time. They really are an impediment. And as I say, it would be quite a big step down from a policy perspective for them not to be withdrawn. That said, there is a lot of noise that they will go back on it, but I don't see it myself.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, it will be very interesting. As you said, we've been living with exchange controls for so long, it will be very interesting to see the landscape without that. But so if it's repealed, what does it mean for immigrants or people that's thinking about moving abroad?
So the big difference is this. I think, and the budget also makes this clear, you're still going to be paying cross-border via the commercial banks. So I don't think you're going to see Royal Bank of Scotland pop up on your named beneficiaries when you want to get to a payment list, okay? Offshore payments will still travel via the commercial banks as they do now with authorized dealers. But the point is approval. That's the crux of it. Currently, you need approval to do things, okay? There are a list of pre-approved transactions. The approval is inherent in the exchange control rulings. So you don't have to ask in each instance. But effectively, the whole regime is subject to an approval system, whether it's the authorized dealer dealing with it or the Reserve Bank. What is going to change is there will be checks and balances and there will be reporting, but on the face of it, you shouldn't need approval. So it's going to make immigration, that is, and let's just be clear, I'm talking about exchange control now. It's important to keep tax, which Sarah spoke about, and exchange control separate. They've got different tests, they're different regulatory regimes. But from an exchange control perspective, it is going to be easier to immigrate. There won't be this long, I don't believe there'll be this long involved list, and there won't be things like blocked RAND accounts, inability to access trust funds, etc. Why would there be if exchange controls have been repealed? So that's the important piece. And although there is reporting, you won't need approval. So theoretically, if I've got however many millions of rands that I would like to export, although I will have to report and undergo some anti-money laundering and perhaps other inquiries, I don't need to ask permission. So, as I say, if the policy as was stated in the budget is stuck to by the government, we will really be seeing a new era where doing offshore business is easier for residents and inward investment. And that must be the aim behind the policy shift.
Okay. So if we then look at financial immigration, what does the concept of financial immigration really mean? And what are the consequences and maybe some of the unintended consequences that one have to watch out for individuals and families when you decide to then eventually financially immigrate?
Yeah, so financial immigration is a term that I don't particularly like. It's not a term of art. If you're a technician, it's kind of sprung up in colloquial parlance, if I can put it that way. There's three things that are separate. Your citizenship, i.e. where you have passports and where you're regarded as a citizen, where you are a taxpayer, and in South Africa, there are not many countries that have this, are you exchange control resident? And the three needed to be assessed separately. Financial immigration, I believe, sprung up as a bit of a catchword for people who were immigrating, who were seeking to change their exchange control residence or end their exchange control residence, to be more specific, and then we're moving abroad and we're going to change their tax residence. Part of the problem that I have with it and some of the confusion that it's created is there does seem to be a perception that financial immigration is an elective thing, that I can choose whether or not I want to be financially resident in South Africa or elsewhere. As I said, there's exchange from a fiscal perspective, there is exchange control residence, and there's a particular test. Are you domiciled in South Africa or not? If you want to cease to be domiciled in South Africa, you have to go through a particular process. Then separately, there's tax residence. You may not be exchange control resident, but you may be tax resident and vice versa. Financial immigration kind of bundled up the two and said to South Africans, effectively, if you immigrate, we will make sure that you do so on a fiscally sensible basis, that you tick all the boxes. And that's really because a number of South Africans, as Sarah alluded to, have changed, for example, their tax residence. It's harder to change your exchange control residence, by the way, but haven't undergone the formalities. And this can come back to bite you a little bit later. From an exchange control perspective, the key process that you need to go through if you are going to financially emigrate for exchange control purposes is you need to, via your authorized dealer, complete what we call a Form MP336. And they ask a whole lot of information. The key thing, by the way, is you need to be able to show that you have an entitlement to live in another jurisdiction. You cannot say that you are immigrating from an exchange control perspective and regard yourself as domiciled somewhere else if you have no right to live there. This has come up particularly in relation to Dubai, where you can't get a residency longer than 2 years in a number of cases.
Great. So I think if we just then look at, this whole issue of expat tax, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about that and about the potential benefits that financial immigration may provide for an expat who's considering his or her options?
Great. Okay, so I'm going to jump back into tax, and you'll see I always try and be rigorous about saying we're talking tax and we're talking exchange control, because it's easy to conflate the two and then you confuse yourself. Okay. So the so-called expat tax, and I'll tell you why it was interesting, but this really has thrown the cat amongst the pigeons to some extent. For a long time in South Africa, if you worked abroad, and dare I say it, 183 days was one of the tests here. This is one of those naughty places where 183 days does come up. But if you were outside of the country for 183 days and some other thresholds, and you were earning remuneration there, that remuneration was exempt. Now, the beauty about that, it was exempt in terms of the Income Tax Act, our domestic rules. You didn't have to rely on a double tax agreement or anything else. It was very easy to do. I earned remuneration abroad. I was outside of the country in these periods. Look at my passport. I don't owe you tax. And it kind of tied into the philosophy that does come out of the double tax agreements of source versus residency and who has the right to tax. And because you're there for more than half the year, it acknowledged that the source jurisdiction, i.e. the place where you're working, can tax you. Now, what they've done is they've changed that rule. That was the so-called expat tax rule. And they've said you only exempt up to 1.25 million. Now, rightly or wrongly, that upsets a lot of people who were availing themselves of that exemption. They seem to be of the view, and I'm really not judging it, but they seem to be of the view that they would like to continue not being subject to tax in South Africa on foreign earned income. So for those people who are working in Dubai or in Africa on sort of projects, a series of projects, it's created a big problem because they are going to be paying more tax in South Africa. I stress that it only relates to residents of South Africa. The exemption applies to residents who are working abroad. So you need to be tax residents in South Africa and working abroad, and you no longer get the same extent of the exemption. The other thing it did, though, which was interesting and which made it even more controversial, is there are a number of South Africans who have emigrated for tax purposes, i.e. they moved away long ago. They don't regard themselves as being tax paying. They haven't spent enough time here to be tax resident, but they haven't completed what we call the exit tax return. And that is a tax return where you say, I no longer regard myself as resident. I'm telling you, and I'm being deemed to dispose of all of my capital assets. Now, if you left in 2008 or 2006, and you wake up in 2020 and you say, well, this change to the expat tax can't affect me because I'm not resident, it does beg the question, can you not be resident if you haven't done your exit tax return? Because that is the procedural formality that shows that you're no longer resident. It's not the test, but it is the procedural formality. So it's caused a lot of problems for people who didn't do the, and I stress, they didn't do their tax properly. If you ceased to be resident, you should have done an exit tax return. They haven't done it. And now the question is, how do I do it? How do I fill it in retrospectively to the date that I did emigrate? If I've had an increase in value in my assets, is that going to be a problem? And these are things that we have to navigate. But the expat tax really came down to a change to the rule exempting income for people who are outside of the country, earning remuneration for more than half a year where they were resident.
So, Andrew, so let's say now this ex-con is repealed. Should one even bother with an immigration process in the next few months?
So the answer is theoretically yes. If you haven't done it yet, barring an about face from a policy perspective, you can hear from the excerpt that I read, immigrants and residents will be treated exactly the same. And I read that to mean that the concept of exchange control residency is going to disappear. So, even in the ordinary course, it was always more urgent to do your tax immigration than your exchange control immigration. Okay, as I say, they're different tests. So it was more important to draw a line in the sand on the tax than the exchange control. And many people kept it a couple of months, years, particularly while they used their 10 million Rand investment and discretionary allowance of 1 million Rand to externalize funds. So if it were me, and what I'm telling my clients is, hold off a couple of months. I can't see any particular urgency in completing your exchange control immigration now. Let us see what comes of the policy change that was announced. And it may be that you don't have to go through the rigmarole of anything formal because exchange control residency would cease. So if you haven't done anything yet and you're not in the guts of the process now, I would personally wait a couple of months to see what happens.
Okay. So, Andrew, and then also, what will I have to show to satisfy the exchange control that I'm immigrating, and who do I really talk to about this?
Another good question. Yeah, so exchange control is administered for all intents and purposes of those of us on the outside by the banks. So all of the commercial banks have an authorized dealer, and that's who you deal with. The process is to complete a form MP336, and there's a whole lot of questions that you need to answer. You need to make sure, amongst other things, that your tax affairs are up to date. And as I say, the very important thing that a lot of people are missing is you need to make sure that you have an entitlement to live somewhere else. You're not on a temporary visa or something like that. But to the extent that you are leaving, and it's actually probably a good time to pause. I touched on it earlier. Immigration is a factual thing. It's not an elective thing. So if you are immigrating for reasons other than you're genuinely relocating yourself, I would be very cautious about going down the formalizing a tax immigration or an exchange control immigration if I'm not genuinely going to live somewhere else for most of the time bona fide. So if you are, then the immigration process from an exchange control perspective is very easy. You make sure your tax affairs are up to date. You get in touch with the bank that you bank with. You notify them that you will be seeking to immigrate for exchange control purposes, and they will assist you. They will provide you the information. But essentially, it is the completion and finalization of a form MP336. And as part of that, you'll need to make sure that you can externalize whatever funds you need to your pension, inheritance, things like that. So that is something that should go into the planning prior to finalizing an exchange control immigration.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I'm also going to rest you a little while. Gavin, you've been waiting patiently for your turn, and I would now want to explore some of the savings and investment related aspects when it comes to financial immigration. So let us start with getting a better understanding about what your retirement benefit options are. Can you maybe in this regard give us a bit of an overview of what one's options are when it comes to dealing with your retirement benefits when you immigrate, and also some idea around the tax implications depending on which option you choose?
Okay, thanks, Johan, and greetings to everybody formally. I think probably the most important thing about the retirement options is that you don't have to exercise them as a matter of priority at any of these points. What the law does allow in the case of retirement annuities is if you, and I'm using Andrew's horrible word, if you financially immigrate and you need to prove that to your retirement annuity administrator that you have financially immigrated, you are entitled, which is not usually allowed, but you're entitled to cash in your retirement annuity and take that item as a lump sum if you're allowed to, and externalize it. The important thing to remember with that is that it is still a lump sum withdrawal from a retirement fund, which means that it's subject to the withholding tax that applies to the withdrawal of a lump sum. When it comes to your pension and provident funds, Obviously, in order to emigrate or to go and live and work somewhere else, you will presumably have resigned from your pension or provident fund, and you're entitled then to take the lump sum ordinarily, even if you were still resident in South Africa. So that choice remains available to you. Always remember, though, that in all cases where you withdraw from a retirement fund, whether it's a retirement annuity by reason of emigration or a pension or provident fund, they will be subject to the lump sum, to the withholding tax on the lump sum, which is a consideration that you have to contemplate when you do fiscally emigrate. The other thing that you should not do with your retirement decision is make that a reason for there to be a trigger of your emigration in total. In other words, it could be a trigger, by doing that, could be a trigger to create a CGT event for your entire asset base to cause you to pay CGT on unliquidated assets in South Africa. So the retirement decision must be a decision that you take after the formal decision to do all the things that Andrew said, which is to fiscally retire, or fiscally emigrate, or to physically emigrate, and then it enables us to continue to do the retirement planning in an unrushed environment, but in the context of your overall planning. Johan, the other thing was the transitioning of your investments. Luckily for us in South Africa, for many people, investments are already internationalized. So the decision of what to do with your investments, again, is separate from the decision, is mostly separate from the decision to emigrate or not to emigrate. So immigration in an investment, from an investment point of view, is simply a transfer of your physical location from here to somewhere else. Your investments could go ahead of you or remain behind, depending on the circumstances that you elect to adopt. So it's very important to look at these things separately from the decision to physically emigrate.
Mm-hmm. So, I think it's one thing to decide that you're going to emigrate, but it's quite another thing as you transition your investments from a timing, tax, costs, and then the exchange rate perspective. Gavin, what are some of the key things that one should be thinking about once you start looking to externalize your financial assets?
I think the most important thing is if you decide to go and live and work and ultimately retire in another country, you have to start viewing your financial circumstances even before you leave the country, from the point of view of your target country. So your financial planning has to be taken from the view of the currency that you're now living in. So if you go and live in Australia, you need to look at the world from an Australian Oz dollar point of view and make your financial plans around the fortunes and the investment outlook of the Australian dollar. And you can do that well in advance of the decision to physically relocate. So again, the investment decisions are a separate agenda item to the overall immigration. It also does show the importance of properly planning a physical translocation somewhere else. Many of my clients have taken years, if not decades, to formally fulfill a decision to go and live in another country. If you do it on a whim, you're sure to make both investment and technical tax and exchange control mistakes. So it's really important to be careful about all of those decisions, and remember that your investment is separate from your physical decision to translocate. You can substantially emigrate your capital well before you emigrate yourself. As an example, again, many of my clients have established businesses where their circumstances allow for it, have established businesses in other jurisdictions in anticipation of ultimately moving there, and they downscale their domestic presence and upscale their presence in the offshore country. And in other words, from an investment point of view, they emigrate themselves in the installments, and they're able to do it in a considered and careful way. And that also, of course, answering your other question, Johan, is the exchange rates and the exchange rate of the currencies that you're moving in. It's important not to make decisions based on exchange rates because you'll never get it right. And it's an important thing to consider the other factors that have caused you to change currency rather than trying to get the timing right on an exchange rate.
Yeah, Gavin, I think, you're right. The first thing is about the same ways that you get your head around the fact that you're going to be living in a new place. You've got to look at the world differently when you talk about assets and liabilities. Your liabilities is now going to be in, as you've called it, let's say, for example, Aussie dollars. You need to think about your assets in that way. And then the other concept, I think, or key thing is that you've mentioned is use a phased approach. Don't try and think you've got to do everything in one go, because that will expose you to market timing risk. It will expose you to exchange rate risk. So you don't really have to do that, all in one go. You could do proper planning with a financial advisor. But then, Gavin, back to the concept of holistic financial planning. And we know that the three broad pillars of holistic financial planning is your wealth creation, which is the investment part that we spoke a bit about now. It's your wealth preservation component, which is the estate planning and wills that Sarah has spoken about. And then also very important is the wealth protection element, which really relates to insurance. Now, what are some of the potential pitfalls to be avoided when it comes to maintaining the necessary insurance cover so that you are not exposed or uncovered during the transition period when moving abroad?
Okay, I think an important consideration here is that the decision to move to relocate has an impact on things like disability and medical cover. Life insurance traditionally and mostly is international, so a contract there are some provisos, but a contract that you've concluded in South Africa will be paid out regardless of where you were to pass away. But in the case of disability, where you have to advise the insurer of a change in your working circumstances, most certainly a decision to go and work in a different country is one of those circumstances. And most disability and medical care protections are country dependent. So the step, once you decide to go and live in another country, and I'm not using the technical term here, but once you decide to go and live there, you have possibly invalidated your disability cover. And at best, you will be wasting the premium. And at worst, you will in fact find yourself without disability cover. And the same applies to medical care. So the advice usually is that you implement, don't cancel the cover here, but expeditiously implement cover in your new residence country, and then cancel your South African cover. In the case of life insurance, obviously you've got a currency differential. Your life insurance is going to be paid out in South African rands, and the premium is going to be paid out in South African rands. So one would normally advise somebody to say, again, go and implement cover in your new country of residence. And once that cover is secure, then you will proceed to cancel your South African cover. And it's obviously important that your liability asset profile may have changed as well. You may have incurred debt in doing the transition to the other country. You may have greater liabilities than you had when you were living in South Africa. So it's important, obviously, to review how much cover you need for both income protection and for life insurance.
Yeah, and I think, we've seen it so many times, and you would have seen it, I suppose, where people didn't get proper financial advice and came to you and said, you know what, we've done everything about saving and about the estate planning, but we just didn't, we didn't just see that this event might happen. And the insurance cover, or the lack thereof, just basically did a lot of damage after all the good work that's been done in the previous years. But, having knowledge about the new investment landscape or your new destination from an investment perspective, I think is very important. So how important is it to do your homework on the investment options, that you'll have at your new destination in order to make sure that your investment and retirement plan still remains on track?
I think the important thing there is to say, when have I emigrated completely? What is the time horizon? Am I going to physically be a resident in another country in 5, 6, 7, 10 years? The other important thing is to understand the vehicles that are available to you in your new country of residence. So a retirement annuity is a well-known concept to somebody who lives in South Africa. But what are the government-endorsed retirement vehicles available to you in your new country? As an example, if one was to redeem the retirement annuity, as I spoke about earlier, can you match it with a contribution to a superannuation plan in Australia? And then your taxable income in South Africa is negated by your tax-deductible contribution to the superannuation plan in Australia. So it's important to familiarize yourself and to get advice on the vehicles that are available to you in the place of residence, and not to assume that just because they have the same or similar names that they work in the same way. So it's important to get advice about what it is that you're actually looking at, because the jargon and the terminology can be confusing.
Yeah, great. No, thank you for that. Yeah, and absolutely, your retirement plan, doesn't stop when you immigrate. It also doesn't really stop with the day that you retire. A retirement plan is pre the retirement date and also post the retirement date, and the same with if you're moving abroad. It's really a long-term planning type of exercise. We've got a few minutes left, and I want to maybe just take this time to maybe just go through one or two of the questions that we've received during the registration process. I think I just want to start off with the first one. Which country is the best country to immigrate to, considering the economic climate, the period before you can become a citizen, and also when you look at it from a skills perspective, and I think it's not an easy answer to that one. I think one will have to pretty much go and speak to many people that maybe immigrated already, and it's really a more personal kind of thing where you will have certain preferences, I suppose. But it is true that some countries are a little bit more open than other in terms of the skills that you have, and obviously other things like your net worth, your health, your years of experience, and also your age obviously becomes very important. So there's quite a number of factors that one needs to consider in deciding which is the best destination for you. Moving on to another question.
Sorry, Johan.
Yes.
Johan, can I interrupt you?
Yes, absolutely.
Apologies. It's a very important point, and it comes up often, and I'm sure the financial guys see it as well. People say, what's the best thing to do now, or what's the best tax decision? The best decision is make your life decision, whatever it is. Where do you want to live? Where are the people who are close to you? Don't go live on a boat called the world if you get seasick. Make your decision as to what suits your lifestyle best. Where will your family be happiest, etc., 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 and then make the fiscal decisions work for you. So in other words, structure them. But your fiscal planning, certainly your tax planning, I don't want to tread into Gavin's area, but I would think your fiscal planning should follow your lifestyle choice. Yeah,
correct. And that is it. Happiness has got different meanings to different people, but ultimately I think it goes back to, it's about relationships and connection first. I think we're experiencing that firsthand with the COVID-19 pandemic and people being isolated. So yeah, no, very, very wise comment there. Thanks for that, Andrew. Maybe then, Andrew, stay with you or with Sarah. Can you, and I know we've covered some of this maybe, but let's try and keep it practical into the questions that were raised. Can you do financial immigration while still owning property in South Africa?
Okay, it's a great question, and Sarah touched on it. The answer is yes. You don't have to utterly sever ties with South Africa to financially emigrate. You can cease to be tax resident if you're no longer physically present here for the days, and if you don't regard it as your home. That's tax done. You can cease to be exchange control resident if you go and live somewhere else. You can still have family here. You can come on holiday. You can own property. You can rent property. You can earn income. You can have a business. No problem at all. Okay? It's a holistic test where we look at a number of factors, and no one factor is going to knock you out. I still own shares in a company, therefore I can't financially emigrate. Not true. You can financially emigrate. It's about where you live. Okay? And the financial piece is about making that you formally sever your ties according to the correct procedure and so that all of the regulators know where you stand. I don't know if Sarah wants to add anything.
Andrew, I think that does cover it sufficiently.
Sarah, while we're with you there, another question, which most probably you did cover in some way again, is it possible to set up a company or trust outside of South Africa? So the question really starts with, I would like to know about being able to financially immigrate while still remaining physically in South Africa. So is it possible to set up a company or trust outside of South Africa to avoid being taxed locally? And where would the best country be, for such a legal entity in order to minimize local taxes?
So I'm going to break that up into two components. So component number one is, can I emigrate and can I remain in South Africa? So remember the different tests that I talked about relating to ordinarily resident. If you are going to be physically present in South Africa, although you financially immigrated, you may not be ordinarily resident, but in this case it almost sounds like you are, because you've immigrated and you've stayed behind in South Africa and you're seeing South Africa as your home. But even if that wasn't the case and it was arguable that you did not have an intention to remain in South Africa, you would still break the physical presence test from what I understand. If you were to stay in South Africa and show that you weren't ordinarily resident, but you show that you had broken the physical presence test, you would start to play around with the days that you were in South Africa for to not be tax resident. So that is the first thing. As to setting up an offshore trust and asking in which jurisdiction it should be, this is such a complex area of law. If there's one thing that I can say is every single jurisdiction is different. Whether you are a South African resident or non-resident will also play a part. And Andrew, I don't know if there's anything that you want to add to this, but there's no one size shoe fits all. In this case, the differences are so extreme between the jurisdictions that you pick that I would be completely remiss to give you a yes or no answer. For something like this, you would definitely want a written legal opinion. Andrew, do you have any thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, I think it is important. There's no one size fits all. If you're a South African going to live in France or New Zealand or America, you should just do this. You have to understand the regulatory landscape of the place that you're going to. Just as Gavin said, you have to understand the investment landscape. You have to understand the regulatory. So a properly implemented immigration normally involves looking where you're going and where you're coming from, taking a bit of advice in both jurisdictions, okay? And then the planning piece is normally bespoke. You would do something very different if you were going to America than if you were going to live in Monaco. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution for it, unfortunately.
And just to add a little bit more confusion to the mix there, if you do elect a country and you've decided based on economic or political factors or closest ties to family, and you decide that there is definitely a double tax agreement between the two countries that could assist, I can tell you that this too can be tricky, because in certain jurisdictions, the double tax agreement with South Africa then dictates that there's certain tax items to be agreed upon by mutual agreement between the taxing authorities. So the moment you think that you have some clarity, unfortunately, in terms of legislation, regulation, and double tax agreements, it then seems that sometimes there is still a lack of clarity.
Okay.
So the single resounding thought is to get a proper written tax opinion.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So just one last question, maybe, Andrew, I don't know if you can answer this one. If you hold a passport for a country you were born in and return to the country after many years, is this regarded as immigration or repatriation? Is there a difference in terms of the financial implications?
So again, where you hold your passport is not relevant for exchange control and tax. You could have been born in the UK and lived there for all of your young adult life, moved to South Africa when you were 20, if you've been here for a substantial period of time, it is likely that you are now tax resident in South Africa and exchange control resident. I stress they have different tests. So it's the passport, and that's why I try and keep these things separate. Passport and citizenship is one. Ex-con is another. Tax is a third. Okay? They're separate. They're distinct. They mustn't be confused. But if you've lived in South Africa for a fairly lengthy period of time, you can pretty much assume you are exchange control and tax resident in South Africa, regardless of your passport, which means you would have to immigrate, just to complete the thought.
Okay. So, and then the other part of the question was, but if you hold a foreign passport, which you're entitled to, but you were not born in that country, is that immigration or repatriation?
It's immigration is actually ceasing to be tax resident or exchange control resident, and both of them normally happen when you cease to be domiciled here. That's the best way I can put it.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to just leave you guys, or just ask you maybe just to comment, give a final comment, Sarah, just final few words in terms of this idea of immigration and the challenges, just from your perspective.
Yeah, so because this is such a complex area of law, I see there's quite a few questions that are coming in from clients asking if they should take legal advice. The one single takeaway that I would like to impart is that the discussion that we've had here touches on very few of the most important things that one would need to consider, but not everything. And it's not intended to be exhaustive. So my takeaway is that you really want to be in a position that you get a written tax opinion from an attorney before making these decisions. It's very difficult to turn around to SARS and claim any certain tax status to them if you haven't bothered to go through this exercise. So if you do have a tax opinion, you can, if any claims arise with SARS, you can say you have a tax opinion, you're following the following advice, and at least it puts you in a position of clarity, of state of mind and comfort that if asked questions, you do have a tax opinion that you have relied on. So right. I really would encourage you to do that. Please don't allow the session to answer all your questions. This is not sufficient to deal with the queries that I'm seeing coming through.
Andrew?
I'd like to say, if you are emigrating or you want to get money abroad, the first thing is don't panic. There's a lot of misinformation and confusion. It's a technical area, but go and see somebody with the requisite skills. 90% of the transactions that people want to do can be easily broken down and explained. So while we go on and we rabbit on lots of things, take your facts, set them out nicely in an email, or go and sit down with somebody, have a chat. The bulk of these inquiries are not impossible, and they are not difficult to help you navigate through. So calm down, understand your own facts so that when you talk to somebody, you can give them a full picture of your facts and circumstances, because each little fact can be key. And then just go and talk to somebody who's got the requisite skills. The law firms, the audit firms from middle tier to upward can assist. The wealth institutions, most of them can assist as well. So don't panic, don't get overwhelmed, don't feel like it's something that's impossible to do. It's not. It's generally very easy. There's a bit of admin to be followed, but it's happening all the time, and people can assist in getting your money overseas, helping you choose where to go, what structures, etc. It's not going to break anything.
Yeah, and I think be willing to pay a fee, because it's a small fee for what could go wrong if you don't do your homework properly. And then Gavin, some last final wise words from the Eastern Cape.
Yeah, Johan and everybody, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all. I think the most important thing is to regard this as the opportunity to review your financial planning holistically. Where you go and live will have its own profile of expenses and income for you. And it's important that you do ordinary financial planning principles. How much will I earn? How much will it cost me to live in the new place that I become a resident? And your financial advisor can help you with that. There's a thing called purchase price parity, which we don't have time to go through now, to work out exactly what your life circumstances are going to be in the country that you decide to go and live in. And that's probably just as important as all the tax and exchange control decisions that you need to take.
Great. Thanks, Gavin. So that concludes our discussion for today. I hope that each and every one of you that attended the webinar has been able to gain some greater insight around this topic of financial immigration that was shared during this session. I really want to thank Sarah, Andrew, and also Gavin for their time and for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us today. We will look to see if there are any other questions that were not answered, and we'll try and get back to you where possible. And thank you again for making time to attend our discussion. And just to note again that a recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone that registered during the next few days. And we wish you all the best and hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you.